Welcome to my channel. I am Professor Nightshade, and tonight, I'll be your guide into the depths of darkness. Germany is a land shrouded in ancient mysteries, chilling legends and shadows that refuse to fade. Its forests, castles, and forgotten ruins hold secrets that have endured for centuries. Secrets that are whispered about, but rarely spoken aloud. Tonight, I invite you to join me as we uncover 3 terrifying tales. Each story will take you deeper into the unknown, and with every step, the darkness will grow heavier, the whispers louder, and the fear more real. Keep your lanterns close and your fears closer. The night is only just beginning. Whispers in the Black Forest. The wind whispered through the dense canopy of the Black Forest as Ethan led the group down the narrow dirt path. Fog clung to the undergrowth, twisting around their boots like fingers desperate to pull them back. The towering trees pressed in from all sides, their gnarled branches tangled overhead, choking out what little light seeped through the overcast sky. "This place is unreal," Maya murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake the slumbering forest. Her curly red hair bounced with each step, though her freckled face looked pale against the surrounding gloom. "Creepy, you mean," Liam said, kicking a loose stone and smirking. "Perfect for a horror movie." Clara adjusted her glasses and gave him a sharp look. "It's also rich with folklore. Superstition and hysteria have shaped the legends here for centuries." She tapped her notebook, already filled with sketches of trees and hastily copied inscriptions from stones they'd passed earlier. Yeah, we get it. Haunted woods, witches, curses," Liam teased, rolling his eyes. "Sounds like a tourist trap to me." "Then why'd you even come?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but edged with irritation. He turned back, his sharp features highlighted by the fading light. "Because," Liam said, flashing a grin, "you guys need someone with guts, and I figured it'd be fun to watch Maya jump at shadows." Maya shot him a glare but stayed silent. Ethan shook his head and focused on the map in his hands. The path they followed had grown narrower, almost imperceptible beneath the layers of dead leaves and moss. "I don't like how quiet it is," Maya said softly. "Relax." Ethan's voice was confident, but the way his eyes flicked to the darkened tree line betrayed a flicker of unease. "It's just nature." But it didn't feel natural. Even Clara, the group's skeptic, paused when they reached a clearing and saw it. A crooked, decaying cabin leaning against the trees as if it might collapse at any moment. "There's no record of this in any of the local maps," Clara said, pulling out her notebook again. She squinted at the runes etched into the wood above the doorframe. "These symbols, they're protective, but..." Her voice trailed off. "But what?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "They're incomplete," Clara said. "Like someone tried, seal something inside," Maya finished, her voice barely audible. Liam was already circling the building, running his fingers along the carvings. "Come on, it's probably just old graffiti." He pushed the door, and it creaked open. The group hesitated, but Ethan stepped forward first, gesturing for the others to follow. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust swirled in their flashlight beams, revealing shelves lined with broken jars, dried herbs, and rusted tools. Animal bones hung from the ceiling, bound together with twine. "This is insane," Liam said, picking up a small, carved idol and turning it over in his hands. "Put that down," Clara snapped. "We don't know what it's for." Ethan ignored them and moved toward the far wall. His flashlight fell on a jagged crack running across a wooden panel, a faint glow pulsing from beneath it. "Check this out," he said, beckoning the others closer. Clara's face tightened. "Don't touch it." But Liam was already there, prying at the edges of the crack with his pocket knife. "Seriously, Liam, stop!" Maya's voice broke, but it was too late. With a splintering sound, the wood gave way, and the glow erupted into the room. The air shifted, heavy and electric as a faint whisper curled through the cabin. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Maya breathed. The whisper came again, louder this time, and the light from the crack faded, plunging the room into darkness. Ethan's flashlight flickered and died. "Get out," Clara hissed. "Now!" But before they could move, the door slammed shut behind them, and the whispers became screams. The cabin trembled as the whispers grew louder, echoing off the decaying walls. Maya clung to Ethan's arm, her breath quick and shallow. Clara fumbled with her flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. Liam cursed, slamming his shoulder against the door. "It won't budge!" he shouted. "Stop yelling!" Clara snapped, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "We need to think." The whispers suddenly stopped. Silence closed in like a smothering blanket, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing. Ethan reached for his phone, but there was no signal. "We'll find another way out," he said, forcing his voice to sound steady. "Stay close." The group pressed forward into the next room, where shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. The shelves were lined with cracked jars, their contents dried and shriveled. Faded parchment covered in strange symbols littered the floor. Clara bent down, picking up a torn scrap. "These runes, they're different from the ones outside." Her eyes darted over the markings. "They're warnings. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was locked away." "Well, now it's unlocked," Liam said, kicking at a broken jar. A sudden thud echoed from above, like footsteps creaking across rotted wood. Maya gasped, stepping back. "There's someone else here," she whispered. "Or something," Clara muttered. Ethan raised his flashlight, and the dim beam catching movement near the corner of the room. A shadow flickered and vanished. "Did you see that?" Maya asked, her voice barely audible. Before Ethan could respond, a low, guttural whisper slithered through the air. "Leave!" The flashlight flickered again and died completely. "Move! Now!" Ethan barked. They stumbled through the darkness, bumping into walls and overturned furniture. Liam kicked the door open and they spilled into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But the forest outside didn't feel any safer. The trees loomed closer than before, their branches tangled overhead like a cage. Fog had rolled in thick, twisting around their legs. "We need to leave," Maya said, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." "No kidding," Liam muttered, but there was no bravado in his voice now. They followed the path they'd come down earlier, or tried to. The trail was gone, swallowed by the shifting forest. The more they walked, the more they seemed to circle back to the cabin. "This isn't possible," Clara said, scanning the area with a frantic look. "We didn't come this way. Are we lost?" Maya's voice cracked. "No," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We just need to—" A scream cut through the trees, sharp and sudden. It was Liam's voice. They turned and saw him stumbling backward, his face pale and eyes wide. Something's out there," he gasped, pointing into the trees. The others turned but saw nothing. "Calm down," Ethan said, gripping Liam's arm. "What did you see?" "It was—" Liam stopped, shaking his head. "I don't know, a shadow, but it wasn't human." As he spoke, the whispers returned, louder now and accompanied by faint footsteps crunching through the underbrush. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at their clothes. Maya tripped, and Clara grabbed her arm, pulling her back to her feet. The whispers swirled around them, mocking and hollow. When they finally stopped, panting and wild-eyed, they found themselves standing in front of the cabin again. "No," Clara whispered, stepping back. "This is impossible," Ethan muttered. Maya was crying now, her hands pressed over her ears. "It's the spirit. We let it out, and now it's keeping us here." Ethan turned to Clara. "You're the expert. How do we stop this?" Clara hesitated, glancing back at the runes carved into the cabin's frame. "We need to repair the seal," she said, "but I need more time to figure out how." "Time we don't have," Liam said, his voice tight. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, and they heard it. Another scream. This time, it wasn't Liam. It was Maya. They turned, but she was gone. Only her flashlight lay on the ground, flickering dimly, before going out completely. Maya's scream still echoed in the clearing, leaving the others frozen in disbelief. "Maya!" Ethan shouted, bolting toward the spot where she had vanished. His flashlight beam sliced through the fog, revealing only twisted roots and empty ground. "She was right here!" Clara's voice trembled as she scanned the area. "We have to find her," Ethan said, already pushing deeper into the woods. "No!" Clara grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "Don't you get it? The forest is shifting, we're trapped, and if we split up, we're dead." Ethan shook her off. "I'm not leaving her out there alone." Liam stepped closer, his voice low. "She's gone, man. You saw what happened. She didn't run. She was taken." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Clara knelt beside the flashlight Maya had dropped, running her fingers over its cracked surface. "The symbols," she murmured, noticing faint carvings around the edges. "They're part of the binding spell." "Can you fix it?" Ethan demanded. I think so, but I need more time to translate the rest." Her hands shook as she flipped through her notebook, matching the markings with her earlier sketches. "Time's the one thing we don't have," Liam said, his voice raw. Another sound rose from the woods. A low, inhuman growl. The shadows between the trees thickened, coiling like smoke. Ethan gripped his hunting knife. "We'll hold them off while you work. Just don't stop." Clara nodded, her eyes darting between the runes and the darkness closing in around them. The forest seemed to come alive. Branches cracked overhead and faint whispers circled them, growing louder and more desperate. Ethan stood his ground, scanning the tree line, while Liam paced, clutching a broken branch as a weapon. Then they saw it. A shape emerged from the fog, a twisted silhouette, its limbs too long and its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth moved, though no sound escaped. "Oh, hell no!" Liam whispered, stepping back. "Stay together," Ethan barked, but Liam panicked. He bolted. "Liam, don't—" Ethan's shout was cut short as the creature lunged. Liam screamed as the shadow swallowed him whole, his voice dissolving into the chorus of whispers. "No!" Clara cried, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "Keep working!" he yelled, dragging her toward the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them as Ethan wedged a chair under the handle. Clara stumbled to the far wall, spreading her notebook out on the dusty floor. "Liam," her voice broke, but Ethan's hand on her shoulder steadied her. "Focus. We'll fix this." The cabin groaned, its walls trembling as if something massive pressed against them. Shadows leaked through the cracks, pulsing like veins. Clara's voice rose, chanting words she could barely pronounce as she pieced the symbols together. The runes began to glow faintly, matching the ones outside. But something else glowed, too. Maya's voice echoed through the room, faint and distorted. "Ethan, help me." Ethan froze, his eyes darting to the corner where the shadows gathered. "Maya, don't listen!" Clara shouted, but it was too late. Ethan stepped toward the voice. The shadows parted, revealing Maya. Her red hair hung limp, and her freckled face was streaked with dirt and tears. "Ethan, it's me," she whimpered. "Please." But her eyes weren't right. They shimmered black, and something unnatural writhed just beneath her skin. "No." Ethan backed away. The thing that looked like Maya smiled, too wide and too sharp. "You let me out," it said, its voice layered with something ancient and cold. Clara screamed as the creature lunged, knocking Ethan to the floor. He stabbed at it with his knife, but it barely flinched. Its hands gripped his shoulders, pinning him. "Finish it!" Ethan roared. Clara recited the final lines of the incantation. The runes flared, casting blinding light through the cabin. The creature shrieked, its voice splitting into 1,000 howls as it staggered back. Ethan threw himself at the wall, grabbing a lantern and smashing it to the ground. Flames erupted, consuming the dry wood. "Get out!" he yelled, pulling Clara to her feet. They burst through the door as the cabin went up in flames. Smoke and fire roared behind them, and the whispers finally fell silent. But as the heat died and the smoke cleared, Ethan felt a burning pain in his arm. He looked down. A glowing rune was seared into his skin, pulsing faintly. "Ethan?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. But Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the mark, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. Ethan sat on the forest floor, cradling his arm as the faint glow of the rune pulsed beneath his skin. The burned remains of the cabin crackled behind him, sending wisps of smoke curling into the night sky. Clara knelt beside him, her face pale and streaked with soot. Let me see it," she said, reaching for his arm. He flinched, but let her pull back the tattered sleeve. The symbol burned into his flesh, glowed faintly, its intricate patterns shifting as if alive. Clara swallowed hard. "This isn't over." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We stopped it." "No," she said, her voice cracking. "We didn't stop it. We just freed it from the cabin. And now—" She trailed off, staring at the mark. "It's in me," Ethan finished, his voice hollow. Clara didn't deny it. Instead, she pressed the notebook against her chest and stood up. "We need to get out of here. Now." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, wincing at the searing pain in his arm. He could feel it. The thing that had stalked them, whispered to them, taken them, still lingering just beneath his skin. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. They didn't speak as they made their way back through the forest, the path somehow clearer now, as though the forest no longer felt the need to keep them trapped. The fog thinned, and dawn began to bleed through the trees, painting the sky in muted grays and blues. They emerged from the woods and stumbled onto the dirt road, where their car sat untouched. Ethan half expected it to vanish the moment they reached it, but the doors opened easily, and the engine roared to life. As they drove away, Clara kept glancing at him. Her hands trembled as she gripped on the wheel. "We'll figure this out," she said finally, but the words felt hollow. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the trees in the rearview mirror, until the forest disappeared behind a bend in the road. Weeks later, Ethan stood in his apartment bathroom staring into the mirror. The rune on his arm still glowed faintly, even in daylight. He'd tried everything, ointments, bandages, even burning it, but it wouldn't fade. It pulsed whenever he slept, dragging him into nightmares filled with shadows and whispers. He turned on the faucet, splashing cold water on his face. When he looked up again, his reflection didn't move. Ethan froze. The image in the mirror stared back at him, its eyes black and empty. Its lips curled into a smile that wasn't his. "No," Ethan whispered, stepping back. The reflection leaned closer. Its voice echoed in his mind, layered and ancient. "You can't run." The rune flared brighter and the whispers began again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the lights flickered and died. The darkness welcomed him. The inheritance. Anna stood at the threshold of the crumbling house, her eyes tracing the jagged cracks in the stone walls and the blackened stains creeping up from the foundation. The keys trembled slightly in her hand, but she steadied herself, brushing aside the inexplicable unease curling in her stomach. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a project to rebuild their lives as much as the structure itself. Behind her, Daniel shifted a heavy box from one arm to the other, his breath visible in the crisp Berlin air. "It's not as bad "As it looks," he said, forcing a grin. Anna tried to smile back, but her gaze drifted upward to the shuttered windows, hollow and watching. "We'll make it work," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The interior was worse. Dust hung in thick layers, disturbed only by the streaks of light filtering through cracked panes. Anna ran a hand over the peeling wallpaper, revealing faded patterns beneath. Lines and swirls that twisted like veins. The floor groaned under their steps, as though it too resisted their presence. "It has potential," Daniel said, already mapping out ideas for demolition and rebuilding. "It's just old." They started clearing debris that afternoon. Anna found relics of past occupants buried under rotting floorboards, a child's shoe, rusted cutlery, a porcelain doll's head with hollow eyes. Daniel dismissed them as junk, but Anna couldn't shake the feeling of trespassing. By the second day Daniel had uncovered the door, it was half hidden behind a warped bookcase, nailed shut and reinforced with iron brackets. The wood was scorched along the edges as the fire had tried and failed to consume it. "Help me get this open," Daniel said, voice tight with excitement. Anna hesitated. Maybe it's just storage, or maybe it's something better. Better wasn't the word she would have used. The air behind the door exhaled when they pried it open, damp, sour, and metallic. Stone steps spiraled downward into a basement that wasn't on any of the house's blueprints. They descended cautiously, their footsteps echoing. The room was larger than Anna expected, the walls lined with rusted metal shelves and broken crates. The floor was concrete, cracked and uneven, and in the far corner sat an old wooden table covered in papers and leather-bound journals. Daniel brushed off the dust and opened one of the books, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "It's German," he said, flipping through the pages. "Looks like logs or records." Anna ran her fingers over strange symbols carved into the walls, jagged lines intersecting circles and spirals. She shivered. What kind of records? Daniel didn't answer at first, his eyes fixed on the yellowed pages. "Experiments," he said, finally, his voice hollow. "Tests." "Tests?" "Medical ones, I think." The silence that followed was suffocating. Anna took the journal from him and flipped through it, her German rusty but functional enough to make out words that sent ice down her spine. Schuld, Opfer, Erinnerung, guilt, victims, memory. She looked up and found Daniel staring at the symbols on the wall. "It's just history," he said, but his voice was less certain now. That night, Anna lay awake, staring at the shadows shifting along the ceiling. From the basement below came a faint sound, like paper turning or whispers carried on the stone. The whispers didn't stop. By the third night, Anna woke with her heart pounding, the faint murmur seeping through the floorboards. She nudged Daniel awake, but he only grumbled and rolled over. He'd been working late in the basement again, cataloging the journals and sketches. "Just the pipes," he mumbled. Anna wasn't so sure. During the day, the house felt marginally safer. Sunlight muted the shadows, and the noise of renovation masked the creaks and groans. Daniel, however, seemed distant. He spent hours in the basement, poring over the journals and muttering half-formed translations. "These are detailed," he said one morning, spreading pages across the kitchen table. Names, dates, even drawings. They documented everything, symptoms, reactions. "It's horrific." Anna skimmed a page, her German struggling to keep up. Test subject 14. Behavioral breakdown after 10 days of isolation. Refused food. Scratched messages into the walls until fingers bled. Subject expired. "Why would anyone write this down?" she whispered. "Because they thought it mattered." Daniel's eyes flickered with something dark, something unfamiliar. "They thought it would help." Help! The word lingered as Anna cleaned up the mess, stuffing the papers back into folders. She didn't like how Daniel had said it, like he was trying to understand the logic behind the horror. And then the noises changed. It started with footsteps. soft at first, then heavier, like boots marching in sequence. Anna froze, her pulse roaring in her ears as the sounds moved above and below her, simultaneously. She rushed to the basement door, calling for Daniel, but when he went near her, his face was pale and streaked with dirt. "What?" he snapped. "Didn't you hear that?" "No," he said, brushing past her. Anna wasn't convinced. She waited until he left for hardware supplies before descending the stairs herself. The basement smelled heavier now, earthy and wet. She moved cautiously, brushing aside cobwebs as she examined the walls again. The symbols seemed deeper, freshly carved. Her fingers traced the grooves and a splinter drew blood. The journals were still scattered on the table, some open to pages Anna hadn't seen before. One showed diagrams of mechanisms, chains, locks, and weighted pulleys, and another depicted human figures bound and bent into unnatural positions. She slammed it shut, bile rising in her throat. Then she saw it, the hole in the far wall. It was narrow, no wider than her shoulders, with bricks piled loosely to one side. Daniel must have uncovered it recently. The air beyond was colder, the darkness thicker. Anna stepped closer but stopped when something shifted inside, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across stone. She backed away and fled upstairs. John. By the time Daniel returned, he looked worse than before. His clothes were dusty and his hands trembled when he set down his tools. "You were digging, weren't you?" Anna accused. "It's just old storage," he said defensively. "There's another chamber back there, probably connected to the war. Maybe more records." "You don't look fine." Daniel's expression darkened. "You're overreacting." But Anna noticed the changes, how he avoided sunlight, how he jumped at sudden noises. He began sleeping downstairs, claiming it was to keep working. But his excuses sounded hollow. She heard him muttering at night, sometimes in German, phrases she couldn't quite translate, but recognized from the journals. One morning she found him staring at the wall, his fingers tracing the symbols. When she touched his arm, he flinched violently. "Daniel," she pleaded, "this isn't you." He turned, and for the briefest moment, Anna didn't recognize his face. The shadows made his features sharper, his eyes darker. "You don't understand," he said, his voice flat. The investigation. Desperate for answers, Anna left the house and went to the city archives. The records were sparse. Most documentation had been destroyed after the war, but she found references to underground bunkers used by Nazi doctors for psychological and biological experiments. One location matched the house's address. Her stomach sank as she read testimonies from survivors. They spoke of sensory deprivation chambers, disembodied voices, and prisoners who were broken until they no longer resembled themselves. But what horrified Anna most was a name: Dr. Heinrich Bauer. She recognized it immediately. It appeared multiple times in the journals Daniel had been reading. Bauer had fled after the war, leaving behind his work and rumors of occult practices designed to tether spirits to places of suffering. The final note mentioned Bauer's obsession with passing his legacy down through bloodlines. Anna clutched the paper, her hands trembling. Bauer had vanished, but his name resurfaced decades later. Daniel's last name, Bauer. Anna drove back to the house, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The revelation echoed in her mind. Bauer. Her husband's name wasn't uncommon, but this wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. By the time she stepped inside, the air felt heavier, damp, and suffocating. The house was darker than when she had left, the shadows clinging to the walls even though the sun hadn't set. "Daniel?" Her voice trembled as she called out. No response. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by dust and grime. The basement door was ajar. Descending the stairs, she found Daniel at the table, surrounded by journals, candles, and broken pieces of stone. He didn't look up. "Daniel?" He was whispering, low, rhythmic, in German. The words made her skin crawl. She edged closer and saw the scratches on his hands, dried blood flaking along his knuckles. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, flicked toward her. They were trying to preserve something, he said softly, almost dreamily. To hold it here, where it belonged. Anna swallowed the panic rising in her throat. You need to stop this. Daniel stood abruptly, knocking over a candle. The flame sputtered but didn't die. You don't understand. It's more than just records. It's unfinished work. It's not work, Daniel. It's torture. Murder. No. His voice hardened. It's purpose. Anna took a step back. He wasn't just obsessed. He was unraveling. That night the house shifted. Doors creaked open on their own. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. Anna heard whispers in the hallways, calling her name in voices that weren't Daniel's. She locked the bedroom door, but the scratching began soon after, faint at first, then frantic, like claws raking wood. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound burrowed into her mind. By dawn, Daniel was gone. Anna searched the house, calling for him, but found only evidence of his descent. More journals, pages marked with symbols she didn't recognize, and a trail of dirt leading back to the basement. Her stomach turned as she approached the door. The hole in the wall was wider now. She stepped closer, the chill radiating outward, making her skin prickle. From inside came a whisper, not words, but a dry, rasping sound that froze her in place. And then she saw them. Hands, pale and twisted, reaching out from the darkness. Anna stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The hands vanished, but the sound of scraping remained. She found Daniel hours later in the basement, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor. The candles had burned down, and their wax streaked the stone like blood. He was staring at the wall, his fingers tracing symbols over and over again. "Daniel!" she screamed, but he didn't respond. She grabbed his shoulders and shook him, but when he turned to her, his eyes were wrong, dark, hollow, as though something had drained the life from them. "They showed me," he whispered. "They told me the truth. It's not over, Anna. It never ended." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "What are you talking about?" Daniel's mouth twitched in something between a smile and a grimace. "He's still here, waiting." "Who?" But she already knew the answer. "Bauer." Her knees weakened. Number. That's not possible. Daniel stood, and for the first time, Anna felt truly afraid of him. He needs someone to finish what he started. She backed away. "You're not him. You're not like them." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor. "Aren't I?" Anna's breath came in ragged gasps. "You're sick, Daniel. This place is making you sick." But he only smiled. The house began to pulse around them. Shadows, bending, whispers growing louder. Daniel's expression flickered between recognition and something foreign, as though he was fighting something inside him. And then he lunged. Anna dodged, scrambling up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind her. She jammed a chair under the handle and ran to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she searched for a weapon. The whispers followed her, louder now, rising into a cacophony of voices, pleading, crying, laughing. Then came the pounding. Daniel was trying to break through the door. Anna grabbed a knife and backed away, her pulse thundering. She couldn't leave him down there. Not like this. But as the wood splintered and the lock gave way, she knew there was no saving him. Not anymore. Anna braced herself as the basement door cracked open. Daniel stood in the threshold, his silhouette framed by flickering candlelight. His face was gaunt, hollowed by shadows, and his eyes glinted with something unnatural. "Stay back," Anna warned, clutching the knife. But Daniel stepped forward, his bare feet leaving smears of dirt and blood on the floor. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice a distorted echo. "We can finish it. Together." "No." Tears welled in her eyes. "This isn't you, Daniel." His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It was always me." Anna's grip tightened. "You're wrong." The shadows seemed to close in around them, pressing against the walls. Anna could feel their weight, their hunger. Daniel advanced, and with a cry, she slashed out with the knife. The blade cut deep across his arm, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed her wrist and twisted, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Anna struggled, but his strength was inhuman now, relentless. He dragged her toward the basement, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. "No!" She kicked and thrashed, her free hand clawing at his face. "Let me go!" For the first time, his grip faltered and Anna broke free. She stumbled back, catching her breath as Daniel loomed in the doorway. "You can't stop it," he said. "It's already inside me." Anna's eyes darted to the basement door. Her pulse hammered as an idea formed. "Maybe not," she whispered. Before Daniel could react, she lunged forward and shoved him hard. He stumbled, lost his balance, and fell backward down the stairs. The thud of his body hitting the concrete echoed through the house. Anna didn't wait. She slammed the door shut and dragged the heaviest furniture she could find to block it. Her hands trembled as she nailed boards across the frame, sealing it shut. From the other side came a sound that wasn't Daniel's voice. It was deeper, rough, guttural. "Anna," it called, but the tone was wrong, distorted and ancient. She stepped back, her breath shallow. The whispers didn't stop. In the days that followed, Anna stayed in the house, too afraid to leave. She checked the basement door constantly, ensuring the boards held. At night, she heard scraping. She searched the journals again, hoping for answers. One entry stood out. "Containment is possible, but the vessel must remain sealed. If the vessel is released, then the cycle will begin anew." Daniel wasn't Daniel anymore. She understood now. The evil had been waiting, festering in the shadows. It had used Daniel as a doorway, and she had barely managed to close it. But it wasn't over. Weeks later, Anna sat in the kitchen, her hands raw from scrubbing bloodstains off the floor. She hadn't called the police. She couldn't explain what had happened. She thought about burning the house, but something held her back. Fear, maybe, or guilt. One night, as she drifted into a restless sleep, the whispers began again. They were faint, like echoes, but she recognized Daniel's voice among them. "Anna," it said. Her eyes flew open. The boards creaked. The whispers grew louder. And this time, she wasn't sure if the door would hold. The Shadow Gate. The van's tires crunched over gravel as it pulled to a stop outside Wewelsburg Castle. Fog clung to the forested hills, its tendrils reaching toward the castle's sharp, angular towers like ghostly fingers. The building loomed against the slate-gray sky, its stone walls darkened by centuries of rain and shadow. Elias Gray stepped out first, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. His dark eyes scanned the architecture, pausing briefly on the carved symbols etched above the arched doorway. Intricate patterns that seemed far older than the castle itself. "This place already feels cursed," Sophia Kane muttered as she joined him, clutching a stack of notebooks to her chest. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, but strands had begun to come loose in the damp air. She adjusted her glasses and scribbled something in her journal, her fingers trembling slightly. Mark Rivers slammed the van door and stretched, the tattoos on his forearms visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. Cursed or not, it's damn impressive. He slung his camera bag over his shoulder and grinned. Perfect for a ghost hunt. Anna Miller lingered near the back of the group. Her pale skin almost glowed in the fading light, and her dark eyes scanned the tree line, as if she expected to see something move. "The castle has waited a long time for visitors," she said softly. Elias raised an eyebrow, but didn't press her. He'd hired Anna for her knowledge of the castle's history, not her bedside manner. She was local, after all, and rumor had it that her family had lived near Wavelsburg for generations. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she knew more than she let on. They crossed the threshold, their footsteps echoing off stone floors. The air inside was colder, damp and heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The grand hall stretched out before them, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows. Mark set up the first camera, his movements confident despite the gloom. Sophia ran her fingers along the symbols carved into the walls, her brow furrowed. "These aren't just decorative," she whispered. "Some of them are runes, protective symbols, but others—" She hesitated. "Others what?" Elias prompted, already adjusting the lights for their first shot. "They're summoning marks," Anna said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark snorted. "You actually believe that?" Anna's gaze darkened. "You don't have to believe in something for it to be real." Elias cut in before Mark could respond. "Anna, tell us about the rituals." Anna led them deeper into the castle. The narrow corridors seemed to tighten around them, the flickering lights casting distorted shadows along the walls. "During World War II, the SS repurposed this castle," she began. "Himmler believed it was a source of ancient power, something they could control. They performed ceremonies here, sacrifices, initiations." She hesitated, but something went wrong. "What do you mean, went wrong?" Elias asked. "They opened a door," Anna said, her voice barely audible, "and they couldn't close it." Night fell quickly. The fog outside pressed against the narrow windows, muting the moonlight. The group gathered in the central chamber, where a massive circular symbol was etched into the stone floor. Elias adjusted his microphone, his voice steady despite the weight in the air. "We are standing in what historians believe was the heart of the castle's ritual activity. This room, known as the Hall of the Dead, is where the SS conducted their most secret ceremonies. According to local legend, anyone who stays here overnight risks being trapped between worlds, haunted by the spirits summoned during those rituals." The words felt heavier as they left his lips, and as if in response, the lights flickered and died. "What the hell?" Mark hissed, fumbling with the camera. A sharp metallic clatter echoed from somewhere above them. Everyone froze. "Anna?" Elias asked, but she was staring at the symbol carved into the floor. Her lips moved silently, repeating something Elias couldn't hear. "They split up to check the breakers and the equipment." Elias and Sophia took the basement, where the air grew heavier with every step. The walls seemed to pulse faintly under the dim glow of their flashlights. Elias ran his hand along the stone, pausing when his fingers brushed against something rough. He turned his light toward it and froze. A red smear, dried but unmistakable. Sophia's breathing quickened as she pointed to a set of rusted chains bolted into the wall. "There's something wrong with this place," she whispered. Upstairs, Mark's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "Guys, get up here. Found something." Elias and Sophia climbed the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing as they emerged into a circular stone chamber. Faded murals covered the walls, robed figures standing around a glowing symbol. At the center of the room, an altar stood, its surface carved with grooves stained dark. Anna knelt beside it, tracing the markings with her fingers. "It's a binding circle," she said. "But the lines have been broken. Whatever they summoned wasn't contained." Before Elias could respond, the air shifted. A whisper rose from the darkness, low, guttural, and ancient. Sophus stumbled back. "We shouldn't be here." But it was already too late. The castle had begun to stir. The darkness in the circular chamber seemed thicker now, pressing against the group like a living thing. Elias felt it first, a subtle vibration beneath his feet, as if the stone itself were breathing. Mark adjusted the camera's lens, his hands unusually unsteady. The altar at the center of the room dominated their focus, its grooves and carvings stained dark, as though the stone itself had soaked in blood. "We need to document this," Elias said, forcing authority into his voice. "Mark, get a wide shot of the altar. Sophia, take notes." Sophia hesitated, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "This feels wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just an empty room," Elias snapped. "Stick to the plan." But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the symbols carved into the walls. There was a rhythm to them, almost musical, and the longer he stared, the more his vision blurred, distorting the shapes into patterns that seemed to pulse with faint light. "Elias." Anna's voice cut through the haze. "Look at this." She pointed to a stack of books half buried beneath a layer of dust and ash at the foot of the altar. The covers were cracked, leather, their pages brittle and stained. Elias knelt and picked one up. The writing inside was German, but the sketches spoke for themselves. Diagrams of human figures bound in circles, surrounded by symbols identical to those carved into the floor. Sophia looked over his shoulder. "This is a ritual manual," she said, her voice trembling. "Sacrifices, bloodletting." They believed it could open a portal to the past, to something ancient. Mark grinned, but there was unease in his eyes. "So, what, they wanted to raise an army of ghosts?" "No," Anna said softly. "They wanted to harness the power of the spirits, bend them to their will." Sophia turned the page, her hands trembling. The next sketch showed a figure wearing a hooded robe, arms raised toward the sky, surrounded by writhing shapes that seemed neither fully human nor animal. "And if they failed?" she asked. Anna didn't answer. The lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on. Mark cursed and fumbled with his flashlight. "I'll check the breakers." "No," Elias said quickly, but Mark was already moving, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor. They waited in silence, the air growing colder with each passing second. The faint sound of Mark's footsteps faded, then stopped altogether. "Mark?" Elias called out, but there was no answer. Sophia clutched Elias's arm. "He's fine. He probably just—" The scream cut her off. It was distant but unmistakable, raw, panicked, and cut short far too quickly. Elias ran toward the sound, his flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. Anna followed close behind, her expression unreadable. Sophia lingered at the altar, flipping through the book as though the answers might leap from the page. The hallway stretched endlessly, its walls closing in as Elias turned corner after corner. Mark's camera bag lay abandoned at the base of a spiral staircase. The strap was torn, as if something had ripped it from his shoulder. Elias hesitated at the foot of the stairs. "Mark!" His voice echoed, thin and hollow. He climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath his weight. The air grew heavier, colder. At the top, he found a door ajar. He pushed it open and stepped into a circular room, much like the one below. The floor was covered in symbols, these ones painted in thick, black strokes. At the center lay Mark's flashlight, flickering weakly. But Mark was gone. Anna stepped beside Elias, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's starting again." Sophia's scream echoed from below. Elias bolted back down the stairs, the sound of his footsteps drowned out by Sophia's ragged cries. He burst into the central chamber to find her kneeling at the altar, clutching her head. Her notebooks were scattered across the floor, pages torn and crumpled. "They're here," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "They never left." Elias grabbed her shoulders. "What are you talking about?" "They opened the door," she said, tears streaming down her face, "and it's still open." Anna's shadow stretched unnaturally along the wall, moving, even though she noted it. "Perfect sticks." "Roshi me perkel," We need to finish what they started, she said. It's the only way to end this. Elias turned to her. What do you mean? Anna stepped closer, her eyes dark and unreadable. They didn't fail, Elias. They succeeded. The rituals didn't summon spirits. They merged with them. The castle isn't haunted. It's alive. Sophia screamed again, this time clutching her throat. Her body convulsed, and for a moment Elias swore he saw something move beneath her skin. Something writhing and twisting. "Help her!" he shouted. Anna didn't move. Elias grabbed one of the books, frantically flipping through the pages. The words blurred together, but he recognized one image. A circle drawn with fresh blood designed to bind whatever had been released. He looked at the altar. The grooves carved into its surface seemed to glow faintly, as though waiting. "We need to finish the ritual," Anna said again. Sophia's screams turned to choked gasps, her eyes rolling back as her body fell limp. Elias grabbed a knife from the altar. "Not her blood," Anna warned. "It won't work unless the sacrifice is willing." Elias turned toward Anna. For the first time, he noticed the faint tattoo on her wrist, a rune identical to the ones carved into the walls. "Who are you?" Her lips curled into a smile. "I'm the key." The lights surged back on, and for a moment everything was blindingly bright. When Elias's vision cleared, Anna was gone. Only her shadow remained, stretched unnaturally across the wall. The room pulsed with a rhythm Elias could feel in his chest, like a second heartbeat. The symbols on the walls seemed alive now, writhing and shifting in his peripheral vision. Sophia lay sprawled near the altar, her shallow breaths echoing through the chamber. Her skin looked pale, too pale, as if something had been drained from her. Elias gripped the knife tighter, the handle slick with sweat. "Anna!" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. But the only response was the faint hum emanating from the altar, a vibration that climbed higher and higher like the sound of something waking up. Sophia stirred, her eyes snapping open. They were black, not just the pupils, everything. Elias stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife. "Sophia?" She sat up slowly, her head tilting unnaturally to the side. "They showed me," she said, but her voice wasn't her own. It was layered, distorted, as though several voices spoke at once. "The blood binds. The blood frees." "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "You're not real." Sophia's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't hers. "You wanted proof, Elias." She rose to her feet in one fluid motion. "Now you'll see everything." The lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the altar. Elias stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the scattered books. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. "Anna!" he hissed, spinning around. But it wasn't Anna. Mark stood in the doorway, or what was left of him. His clothes were shredded, and deep gashes marred his face and arms. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Elias froze. "Mark!" Mark's head twitched like a puppet on broken strings. "You shouldn't have come here." Elias turned to run, but the door slammed shut. The stone walls seemed to shift, closing in, their carvings glowing brighter now, bathing the room in crimson light. Sophia advanced on him, her steps slow but deliberate. "The circle must be completed," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You have to finish it, Elias, or it'll never let us leave." Elias's heart pounded. He scrambled through the scattered books, searching for answers. The sketches blurred in front of him, hooded figures, spirals, bloodletting. He couldn't make sense of it. "The altar," Anna's voice whispered. He looked up, but she wasn't there. Only her shadow stretched along the far wall, distorted and elongated. "Elias." The whisper came again. closer this time. He spun around, but the chamber was empty, except for Sophia and Mark, their black eyes fixed on him. "Elias!" The voice came from within his own head now, and suddenly he understood. The castle had chosen him. The whispers, the visions. It was all leading to this moment. He grabbed the knife and stepped toward the altar. The grooves in the stone seemed to pulse in response, as if hungry. Sophia lunged at him. Elias barely dodged, slashing the knife in desperation. The blade sliced across her arm, but instead of blood, a black, oily substance seeped out, writhing and twisting like living tendrils. "Finish it!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the chamber. Mark's broken body lunged next, his movements jerky and unnatural. Elias swung the knife, catching him across the chest, but Mark didn't stop. He grabbed Elias by the throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. Elias kicked and thrashed, the knife slipping from his fingers. Darkness swam at the edges of his vision as Mark's grip tightened, and then, suddenly, Mark dropped him. Anna stood behind him, holding a torch. Flames licked at Mark's back, and he screamed a guttural, inhuman sound as the fire consumed him. Elias coughed, scrambling away from the burning figure. Anna dropped the torch and turned to him, her eyes wild. "We don't have time," she said. "It's breaking He monster the in the ground beneath them trembled. Cracks splintered outward from the altar, and the light pouring from the carvings grew blinding. Anna grabbed his arm. "The circle! We have to seal it!" Elias reached for the knife, his fingers closing around the hilt just as a low, guttural growl rose from the depths of the chamber. A shape emerged from the altar. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything Elias could name. It towered above them, its form shifting and twisting as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Its eyes burned with light, and its shadow stretched impossibly long, covering every wall. Elias raised the knife, his hands trembling. "Tell me what to do." Anna's voice was distant now, muffled beneath the roar of the creature. "The blood binds, the blood frees." He didn't understand, not until he saw the look in Anna's eyes. She stepped back, baring her wrist. "It has to be willing," she said. "No." Elias shook his head. Anna grabbed his hand, guiding the knife to her palm. "It's the only way." Before Elias could stop her, she dragged the blade across her skin. Blood pooled in the grooves of the altar, and the creature screamed, a sound so terrible it shook the walls. The light flared, blinding Elias. He dropped the knife and fell to his knees, covering his ears as the roar filled his head. And then, suddenly, it was over. The chamber fell silent. The carvings faded. The air grew still, but Anna was gone. Only her shadow remained, burned into the stone floor, frozen in the act of sacrifice. Elias stumbled back, his heart racing. Sophia lay motionless beside the altar, her eyes closed. Mark's body was gone. Only ash remained. The castle was silent, but Elias knew it wasn't over. Not really. He looked down at his hands, still stained with Anna's blood. The symbols on the walls flickered faintly as if waiting. And somewhere deep beneath the castle, the whispers began again. Elias staggered out of the chamber, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. The castle groaned around him, its stone walls seeming to shift as though exhaling after centuries of tension. The blood-streaked altar pulsed faintly behind him, its hunger momentarily sated. But the silence that followed felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant. Sophia's limp body lay near the edge of the room, her breathing shallow but steady. Elias knelt beside her, shaking her shoulder. "Sophia," he said, his voice raw. "Wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, no longer black, but glassy and unfocused. "Elias." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You're okay," he lied. "We have to move." He pulled her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they stumbled through the twisting corridors. The symbols etched into the walls no longer glowed, but they seemed darker now, as if scorched into the stone. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, their edges shifting when he looked away. They reached the entrance hall. The heavy wooden doors loomed before them, cracked slightly open, revealing the thick fog that still clung outside. Elias felt his pulse quicken. They could leave. But as he stepped closer, the doors slammed shut. "No," he whispered, dropping Sophia and throwing himself at the wood. He pounded on it with his fists, ignoring the pain that shot up his arms. "Let us out!" The echoes of his screams died away, leaving only silence. Sophia stirred behind him, her voice weak. "Elias." He turned and froze. Her shadow stretched unnaturally long across the floor, curling at the edges like smoke. The patterns in the stone seemed to ripple toward her, as though drawn to the darkness emanating from her body. "Help me," she said, but the voice wasn't hers. It was layered, distorted, just like before. Elias backed away, his heart thundering. "No," he said. "No, we ended this." A whisper slithered through the room, low and guttural, carried by a breath of freezing air. It was the same voice he'd heard in the chamber, the voice that had called to him, coaxed him deeper into the castle's grasp. Sophia's eyes went black again, and her lips twisted into a smile that wasn't her own. "You didn't end anything," she said. "You only opened the door wider." Elias felt something crawl beneath his skin, cold and electric, as though unseen tendrils were burrowing into him. The knife in his hand grew heavy, its blade darkened with Anna's blood. Anna. Her shadow still lingered in his mind, burned into the stone, a permanent mark left behind by her sacrifice. But had it been enough? Or had it simply fed the castle something stronger? Something living? Elias stumbled back, his hand brushing against one of the walls. The stone felt warm, pulsing faintly, like flesh. His vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't in the castle anymore. He was in the past. Torchlight danced on the walls. Hooded figures circled the altar, their chants rising and falling in guttural waves. Blood dripped down the grooves of the stone, filling the circle and feeding the thing that writhed beneath it. Elias's breath caught. He saw Anna among them, or someone who looked like her, leading the ritual, her voice raised in song. And he saw himself, bound and kneeling at the center of the circle. The vision shattered, and Elias fell to his knees. The whispers surrounded him now, endless and suffocating. "Join us," they said. Sophia stepped closer, her shadow writhing like smoke. "You were chosen," she said. "You're part of this now." "No," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "I won't." But the shadows moved, wrapping around his feet, his legs, his arms. The knife trembled in his hand, but he couldn't bring himself to drop it. A thought whispered through his mind, cold, certain. The blood binds. The blood frees. Sophia reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Her touch burned. "Finish it," she whispered. And for the first time, Elias understood. The castle didn't want them dead. It wanted them to stay. He acted without thinking. The knife slashed across Sophia's throat in one clean motion. She gasped, her eyes widening in shock as her blood spilled onto the floor, filling the grooves of the altar. Even from this distance, the castle screamed. The shadows writhed, recoiling from the blood, but it wasn't enough. The symbols flared to life again, brighter and more violent than before. The doors burst open. Elias ran. He didn't look back. He didn't stop, even as the whispers clawed at his mind, even as he heard Sophia's voice calling his name from the darkness. He stumbled out into the fog, the knife still clenched in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he finally reached the van, he collapsed against it, the blade slipping from his fingers. The castle loomed behind him, silent and watchful. The fog began to lift, but the shadows inside him didn't fade. Weeks later, Elias sat alone in his apartment, the blinds drawn and the lights off. He hadn't spoken to anyone since that night. No one believed his story. Sophia's body was never found. Neither was Mark's. But the whispers remained. At night, Elias would see shadows move across the walls, stretching and curling like smoke, and sometimes he would catch his own reflection moving out of sync, its lips twisting into a smile that wasn't his. One evening, he woke to find the knife on his bedside table, clean, polished, waiting. The blood binds. The blood frees. Elias stared at it, his hands trembling as the whispers began again.